Hello, and welcome to this 10-minute talk. We're looking at professional services firms today, and we're looking specifically at the sale of professional service firms and the acquisition of professional services firms by other businesses. We've rather crudely referred to the session as will they buy us and how much will they pay. I think that's designed to demonstrate that we're looking at sort of the practical side of things and the things that really go to the heart of what owners of professional services firms are really interested by. We're delighted today to be joined by two really excellent speakers, Andy Poole and Zulon Begum. I'll perhaps invite each of them to introduce themselves to get ourselves going. Andy.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me along. Hello, Corinne. Hello, Zulon. Hello to everybody watching out there today. I'm Andy Poole. I'm legal sector partner at Armstrong Watson, and for over 20 years now, I've done nothing but advise lawyers, and latterly exclusively so in the mergers and acquisition space in the legal sector. So I've got a huge amount of experience in terms of the exact topic we're talking about today, which is putting deals together, maximising value, and making sure people get the right end result.
And Zulon.
Hi, Corinne. Hi, Andy. Nice to see you. So I'm a partner at CM Murray, and I advise mostly firms on transactional matters, so mergers and acquisitions, as well as governance and structuring and other partnership issues.
That's great. Thanks so much, Zulon. So as you can hear, two really fantastic experts that can really get to the heart of some of the issues. So I'd like, if I may, just to set the scene. We're thinking here about a professional services firm that's thinking about selling to, in this particular scenario, we're thinking about a larger business that's so selling into a larger business that wants to acquire your firm. Obviously, every single case is going to be different, but what we're going to do today is explore themes in that particular scenario. Obviously, in a professional firm context, we often refer to mergers, and I think that's probably accurate in lots of cases, but in this particular scenario, we're thinking probably more in the context of an acquisition, where a business is being sort of consumed by a larger or a broader business, and so you'll hear us using that terminology quite a lot. And this particular session, we're going to look at value, and then the next in the second of this series is going to look at sort of some wider issues. So I think I'm going to start perhaps by coming to you, Andy, because we often see professional firm mergers not for value, where there isn't actually consideration paid. And I think that one of the really thorny questions for a professional services firm is, how do you actually get an acquirer to pay cash for a professional services firm?
Well, there are actually quite a few acquirers out there at the moment who are active in the legal sector space who are paying. There are some private equity backed, there are some listed, there are some national players that are all actually paying quite decent amounts of goodwill valuation over and above the net asset value of the business. And that's partially driven by their position in the market, but they're only targeting the businesses clearly. They're going to provide a return on that investment for them. But there are also, probably the majority of the transactions within the legal sector are succession driven. They are exit driven. They are driven by an aim of avoiding paying the professional indemnity insurance runoff cover, and therefore seeking to have successor practice status taken. And where you've got that, and particularly with the smaller firms, where you've got the key people, where all of the brand goodwill is vested in those individuals, and at the end of the day, we are predominantly people business within professional practices. You've got the ability, once they go, well, all the goodwill and all the value may well go. And particularly when you link that with the fact that they are needing a succession option, that then means that the majority of the transactions are probably structured like a merger, even though there's a larger organisation coming in and taking over. And in those situations, what you probably will end up with is successor practice status, and most probably the equivalent of the recoverable net assets paid over a period of time. You may get a bit of an incentive, you may get a bit of an earn-out that goes alongside it. But if you fall outside of that category, where you can prove that there is actual brand value, where there is entity value, where it isn't vested all in the individuals, or where there is a plan to be able to retain those individuals, to be able to pass that value on, and be able to prove a track record of a return on investment that is capable of continuing for the new owners, that's when you start to get into the realms of a potential valuation, which might then be on a multiple-based EBITDA approach. And because we've got these professionalised acquirers coming into the marketplace now, they are professionalising the method of those acquisitions, and therefore the method of the valuation itself as well. So there are values that are being paid, but you need to be able to show that you've got a track record. You need to be selling at the right time. You need to have the evidence to be able to back up the fact that this ongoing profit stream will continue, and that the buyer can have confidence that that will then accrue to them.
So in order to sort of sit at that point in the graph where you are demonstrating that you've got that ability to generate future revenue, to kind of that consistent track record, the fact that the track record is going to continue, the fact that the goodwill is invested in, for example, the current partners and no one else. What can firms do to demonstrate that to potential acquirers, but also to kind of set themselves up? How can they structure themselves so as to be driving towards that as a potential future outcome in terms of their succession planning and their strategy over the long term?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a few things that are in there. I mean, ultimately, a lot of the valuations are done by the EBITDA figures that are shown in the sets of financial statements. So we need to make sure we've got a good track record of that underlying profitability. So the EBITDA is the earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. A proxy for that in professional circles is look at your bottom line net profit and make sure that we've got a track record of growth of that. But also that once you've then taken away the pay to replace the key people, i.e. the partners in most circumstances, that figure usually needs to pay effectively for the partners' fee earning time. Once you've replaced that with a notional market salary, what are we then left with? So we've got to start thinking what is really there for a potential acquirer to be able to take away, because even if that individual isn't staying and having to pay for them, we'll have to pay for replacement cost. So we need to make sure we've got that and we understand that. We also need to be keeping records around, what are the sources of the work? Why are people instructing us? And if it is because of key individuals that there's a potential flight risk, then again, there's a risk to the acquirer, and therefore they may not pay as much. So we need to be able to not just say why something is the way that it is, we need to be able to prove it with some records. So keeping information on sources of work coming in is important as well. And finally, it's looking at the roles of those owners of the business. And many times before we start to look at potential acquirers for businesses, when we're starting to get people ready to go to those potential acquirers, key questions are, what do you do? What is your role? What would happen if you suddenly exited the business? Would it continue without you? And what can we do to be able to make sure that actually you're far less important than you historically have been, or that you probably want to feel as though you are as an individual, with a key role within a professional services business? Because the more you can show that you're not needed, the more the value is there for an acquirer.
So make yourself unimportant. There's a top tip for life. Great, thank you. So the first half of your career, make yourself important, and the second half, make yourself unimportant. Thanks, Andy. And Zulon, I'd like to come to you now, if I may. From a legal perspective, obviously Andy's talked about some of the factors that influence value, which is really interesting. From a legal perspective, how do firms prepare for a transaction, either an acquisition, I suppose a merger too, but what sort of things are they going to do? What puts them in the best possible position, both to be attractive to a potential purchaser, but also be ready for a transaction of that nature?
First, I'd say thinking about these things way in advance. It's the example that Andy uses about people coming up to retirement and a lot of transactions being driven by succession issues and avoiding having to pay successor practice. Run-off insurance and ensuring successor practices passed on. Those types of founder-led businesses really do need to think about things way in advance, because the closer you come to that point where you want to retire as a founder, the more difficult it is to actually find a willing buyer just to take the business, let alone for value. I guess the next thing is around actually understanding what you want to achieve, whether you're a founder or you're kind of a business of several different partners, and what you are trying to achieve in terms of transaction. It can't just be around making money. It has to be some other hook in order to kind of make yourself attractive as a potential kind of acquisition by any buyer. So what it is you're trying to achieve, and what kind of strategy you need to put in place in order to achieve that, to find the right buyer to acquire the business, I think is really important. And then lastly, I would say actually making the business ready for that potential acquisition or sale. So doing a level of kind of own due diligence around and kind of addressing any red flags that any potential buyer will be looking at, because there will be a lot of scrutiny over the business, including around finances, including around people issues, whether, and again, looking at that, what it is exactly the buyer is paying for. Is it, a business that is very much heavily dependent on relationships rather than an annuity type business that means that partners are, in inverted commas, unimportant. That will certainly affect the values. If it is around relationships, understanding how you plan to transfer those relationships to the buyer, or actually keeping some of those partners in the business for the long term. So that means ensuring that your current partnership deed, for example, has sufficient kind of protections for the business. So long enough notice periods so that partners are not leaving on short notice, restrictive covenants against clients taking, both clients and other teams in the business. So the value isn't dissipated in the run up to any transaction or soon after it, because those are the kind of key things that any potential buyer will be looking at.
Fantastic, thank you, Zulon. Andy, can I put you on the spot? You talked before about multiples, and the literal $1 million question that will be on the tips of all these sort of law firm owner tongues is what sort of multiples might firms be able to consider at the very extreme end of a really well-run sort of kind of business that is an attractive prospect. What might that look like?
There is a bit of a range. Where you fall into the category that I described earlier, that where it's being succession-led, where there isn't any brand goodwill, there's no multiple at all. But once you start to get into the brand multiple, the multiples tend to be of EBITDA after having allowed for the notional partner salaries and making sure it's a maintainable level, etc. Tend to be somewhere between 2 and at the absolute extremes at the top 8. But if you start getting beyond the 6s up into the 8s, it's the very extreme, right at the very top. And from what we can see, it's as much as who's buying as who's selling and what the characteristics are of the vendor, because it tends to be that the bigger players, the listed entities, the private equity backed players will be the higher end of that multiple. The national firms will probably be in the middle, and the regional firms will probably be at the bottom end, and that's just economics in terms of where they're positioned within the market, also the types of firms that they're buying as well. What we tend to find is that where you're in a niche that can provide a good differentiator, but it's a sustainable niche, you tend to be higher up in the multiples. For some full service firms where you're protected against, for example, exposure into personal injury or into residential conveyancing, again, that can be helpful in terms of the multiple. So we need to be looking at risks to the business itself. The larger businesses, again, tend to be a little bit higher multiple than the smaller businesses as well, because, again, we're moving away from reliance on key individuals. So there's quite a few factors that go behind it. I'd say an average across most typical law firms will probably be somewhere between 3 and 4.
That's really, really helpful, Andy. Thank you. And this isn't advice, don't take it as such, but it is really helpful for people listening to have an idea of where they can sit on that spectrum and what factors can move the dial in the way that they want it to move. I'm conscious of time. Could I invite each of you to offer me a top tip before we sign off? Maybe coming to you first, Zulon.
Well, I think it's kind of reiteration of what I've already said. Having a plan, having a strategy, and understanding your business very carefully, and your partners as well. So what motivates your other partners? Are they on board? Because, unless everybody's rowing in the same direction, it's going to get very difficult to actually get any kind of transaction over the line. So advanced kind of planning on all of those fronts is really important.
Thank you. And the last word from you, Andy.
Yeah, my top tip would be making sure you monitor the right information that shows that you are on top of it in terms of managing your own business. You need to make sure that if a potential acquirer asks you for a piece of information that's important to them, that you can show that you can provide that to them quickly, which then provides so much confidence to the acquirer that they think, well, these guys know what they're doing. They know what the key pieces of information are. They've got it to hand. They're monitoring that. They're obviously all over it. And the quicker you can respond to pieces of information, the more, the better that you will be viewed by the potential acquirer.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much. Really interesting sort of to understand what's relevant if you're trying to place yourself to look out for attractive offers and to position yourself to be well placed to get an attractive offer. I would encourage people listening to look out for the second of this series of 2, which we're going to spend some time thinking about. If somebody has made an offer, should you accept it, and how should you manage that offer? So please do look out for that. In the meantime, thank you for joining us.